Last night, I dreamt I went to Manderley again.
Hi, I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 29. This summer, we wanted to have a bit of fun and move away from our normal schedule of multi-episode topics. So we've been discussing movies, including adaptations of popular books and major figures in the horror genre. We've done a few of these Master of Horror episodes, and for our last one this summer, we let you, the listener, choose. You voted, and we obeyed your command. So here's your Master of Horror, Daphne DuMaurier. This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you.
Okay, as Lisa mentioned at the end of our introduction, this is our listener-chosen Master of Horror episodes, our final Master of Horror of the summer before we get started into our new season. And we offered up a few choices via social media. And DuMaurier won out on both Twitter and Facebook with over half the votes. Alfred Hitchcock was a close second. So we thought we would cover his adaptation of her work in this episode as well and kind of make it a twofer. So Rebecca, that will be the core of our argument. But as we said with Ray Bradbury, we know that Daphne DuMaurier and Alfred Hitchcock are both huge masters of horror with a lot of work under their belts that we can talk about. And so we, as always, want to reserve the right to return to both of them in the future to deal with some films and books and maybe even some of their other connections between the two. So, Lisa, would you like to take over and kind of give us some background and biography on DuMaurier?
I would love to. So I will admit I have always said I was a fan of hers, but when I said I was a fan of hers, what I really meant was I was a fan of Rebecca. So in preparation for this episode, we got to do a little bit of digging into her life, and now I am really eager to find a good biography on her because it sounds like she lived a fascinating life. Here are just a few things. First of all, she was born in 1907, and the family that she was born into is pretty amazing, even before she wrote anything. Listen to this. Her grandfather, George DuMaurier, was a cartoonist and an artist and a writer. And he was famous for writing the book Trilby, which came out in 1894, in which he created the very famous, or I guess I should say infamous character, Svengali. Her father, Gerald DuMaurier, and her mother, Muriel Beaumont, were both actors. So they were both in the creative field. Her father especially was famous at the time. And her father's sister was Sylvia Llewellyn Davies. And if that name sounds at all familiar, it's because she was the mother of the boys who famously inspired J.M. Barrie to create Peter Pan. So there's a whole other kind of branch of the DuMaurier family that made an indelible mark on literature. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And again, she really didn't have anything to do with that. It was just famous family members. But a little bit about her. She was one of three girls. She was the middle daughter. And she especially loved going to her family's home in Cornwall because of the solitude. And she was known, I think, as a little bit, I don't know if hermit's the right word, but she was somebody who enjoyed staying at home and writing and I guess the solitude that it provided. So in 1931, she published her first book, The Loving Spirit. The next year, she married a man named Frederick Browning, who was in the military. They had 3 children. But here's what I thought was a really interesting note, is that even though she was married and, he had a career in the military, she was considered the family breadwinner, which I think for the 30s, at least unusual way of forming a family for the woman to be the breadwinner. But she kept her family living pretty well solely through her writing. There is a bit of a rumor going around that she was a bisexual, that she had especially an attraction to Mrs. Doubleday of the publishing house, who published several of her books. But again, I don't want to speculate too much about that, but it is a rumor floating around there. But she was a self-professed tomboy, saying that her father had always wanted a boy. She had often wished she was born a boy. So that kind of, I think, shaped who she was in her life, but she was apparently a very interesting person. She wrote several nonfiction books, including, of course, some biography on her family members. But she also wrote a bit about herself, including one book that came out in 1977 called Growing Pains, The Shaping of a Writer. And I believe there were some biographies written about her after her death in 1989. I'm not entirely sure about that, but I think there are some floating around out there that were written by family members of hers. Anyway, so that's just kind of a brief history. Of course, I left out the major works because I'm hoping that we'll get to talk about those more in depth, but that's just kind of an overview of her life and who she was. If you can boil somebody down to a little 5-minute blurb on their life, that was hers. So now, Mel, you're a big fan of Rebecca as well.
Well, I have to admit, to my shame, that while I watched the movie Rebecca several years ago, well, so many years ago that I had to rewatch it for this episode and really loved it, I actually had never read Rebecca until I knew DuMaurier was a choice for the listener episode. So I went ahead and read Rebecca, like a month or so ago, so I'd get it done before the semester started, and I loved it. And I was kicking myself, like, why the heck didn't I pick this book up earlier? Because it is just, I think you and I were texting at one point, the kind of the influences I saw between Rebecca and, of course, our favorite writer, Shirley Jackson, and The Haunting of Hill House. And, of course, you have those wonderful connections between Rebecca and Jane Eyre. And I think you had mentioned, Lisa, that some people draw connections between Rebecca and The Turn of the Screw. And, like, these are all my favorite books. I don't know why it took me so long to get into it. Oh, also, I'm a huge fan of Jasper Ford, and the fact that Mrs. Danvers is like a clone army of like assassins. It's just a wonderful, wonderful thing. And so and getting DuMaurier's take and not just looking at the Hitchcock adaptation was great. So thank you, listeners, for giving me the kick in the pants to read this book that I probably should have read a long time ago.
Well, you know, I was like you. I had actually seen the movie first, and the more I started thinking about it, you know, I've always been a lover of books. Somebody showed me the Hitchcock version of Rebecca when I was in college, and it was one of these very odd moments that can only really happen at a university setting. But I met somebody, and she was like, you know, there's this movie I really love, and I think you'd like it too. Why don't you come and watch it? And of course, it was like 2:00 on a Tuesday afternoon, and I was like, sure. You know, I remember going to her dorm room, and she showed me this movie, and I was instantly in love. And so I went out and found the book, and I read the book after I had seen the movie. But I really think that was one of the first truly Gothic novels that I had read, which is interesting because throughout her life, she was really characterized as a romantic writer. And I don't know if that had to do with the way they were using the term romantic or romance at the time, or the fact that she was a woman writer. But, you know, this is something that we had talked about, Mel, before. Her work is, to me, is purely in the Gothic tradition. You mentioned a few of the books, Jane Eyre. Rebecca and Jane Eyre read like companion pieces. And it was documented, I think she had said it several times, that growing up she was a big fan of the Bronte sisters and read them widely and read them often. And Jane Eyre was especially her favorite. But it's hard to look at something like that, or even, you know, Henry James, his novella, The Turn of the Screw. You have in both cases, a heroine who seems to at least elicit our worry a little bit. I don't want to call them weak characters, because Jane Eyre I certainly don't think is a weak character. But she makes us worry about her at times. And, you know, there's the of course, the big manor house or mansion in certain cases that's very isolated. And then there's the brooding male figure that seems to be pretty ominous. In The Turn of the Screw, that character is a little bit less. He just kind of pops in and out, but he's still casting a shadow over the place. And all of these are very, very traditional Gothic tropes. And so to me, she is very much in that Gothic tradition. In fact, I think often you'll see her work referred to as Cornish Gothic because of the place and the setting that she does. I know that at one point, and I wish I had written it down when I saw it, but I didn't, and I couldn't find it again. But she was actually accused of plagiarism by another writer.
A Brazilian writer, I think.
Yes. And do you remember, was it Jamaican? Or
I believe it was Rebecca.
Okay. I couldn't remember which one of the two it was. And she basically said, look, the places that you are accusing me of plagiarism, these are pretty common in all sorts of literature. So she was kind of basically making the claim that, look, I'm working within a very definite genre here, and that there are certain tropes that I'm playing with, and yes, it's going to bear a certain similarity to other books that are doing the same thing. And so, the lawsuit, I don't think, held any water. But it is interesting that with the success, especially of Rebecca, that people were coming after her like that.
Well, I mean, while the book itself totally kind of enthralled my attention. It was very difficult to put down. I just totally went with it. But at the same time, I was constantly thinking of all the things it reminded me of. And yeah, I believe, if I'm correct, there were a couple other people who tried to sue her for plagiarism when the Hitchcock movie came out, because they were like, oh, this is like a book that I had written. Now, I don't know all the details, and I'm not necessarily going to, pick sides here, but the storyline of Rebecca is just so common to a certain extent. I mean, it's kind of like a boilerplate plot, but what she does with it, especially with that character of Mrs. Danvers, is just so interesting. And so I could see people writing very similar types of novels, but it's not like she read them and then wrote down the exact same thing, if that makes sense.
Well, and I think that's the mark of a really talented writer, because especially, and I guess I don't want to harp on this point too much, but when you're writing something that would be considered genre fiction, there are certain plots that people go to over and over again. And I mean, I'm looking on my shelf right now. I did my dissertation on Gothic novels, and I could list off 5 that share very, just right off the bat, that share very different, as you said, or very similar plot devices to what she's doing with Rebecca. But a skilled writer will be able to take those well-known and well-loved plots and really be able to do something fresh with it. And I think she is one of those. I think that's why her book has remained in the public eye and others have kind of faded away. But Mel, you've mentioned Mrs. Danvers several times. And so I really want to hear your thoughts.
Well, before we get to that, can I ask you a Gothic question?
Oh, please do. This is my favorite.
Okay. Do you think that Rebecca qualifies as what people call the female Gothic? I know you mentioned it's Cornish Gothic, but it seems like to me it has, and I know the female Gothic is a contested term, but it seems like Rebecca has a lot of the hallmarks of that. Am I correct?
I would certainly call it a female Gothic, mainly in the way it treats, well, for a couple of reasons, but she's very much, I think, a granddaughter of, maybe a literary granddaughter of Anne Radcliffe. And for those of you who may not know the terms male and female Gothic, when I'm describing them, female Gothic is more of the Anne Radcliffe flavor of Gothic. You tend to have a woman in peril. There's usually some sort of marriage plot involved. So, a wealthy man has either married her or is trying to marry her, and we're not entirely sure of his morals or his motive for doing it. And generally the focus is less on the horror and less on the kind of gore and violence and more on the terror. It's much more psychological, and that usually plays out in the main character, who is a female. And that character usually has to become somewhat of a detective and figure out what is actually happening in the house. Is this house haunted? famously, I guess, for Anne Radcliffe, who liked to work with the explained supernatural, the house usually wasn't haunted. There was some sort of real world explanation for what happened. And you kind of see the same thing in Rebecca. So male Gothic is kind of the antithesis of that. You've got the same plot of a woman who is in peril at the hands of a more powerful male character. But then if you're talking about a book like Matthew Lewis's The Monk, then it's going to be much more on the horror side of things. There's going to be a lot more body horror that happens, a lot more violence, a lot more gore, a lot more in-your-face blood that's going to happen, rather than a more quiet, subdued terror that may last longer. And Rebecca, if you look at what happens to her throughout the course of the story, here she is kind of left to her own devices in this large house. And she has inside forces and outside forces that are basically trying to convince her that she's crazy. And there is kind of this haunted element of a past that she's got to figure out what's going on, but also kind of hints at what could be her future. And so in that way, I think it does qualify as a female Gothic. Yeah, I think so. That may have been more of an explanation than you wanted when you asked me that question, but...
No, that's fine. That's fine. I completely agree. And yeah, as you were describing it, it's like you were basically describing Rebecca. Because it's like, this book just fascinates me so much because there's so much happening in it. It's hard to tell even where you should start. Because when I was texting you about it, I think when I was finishing it up, or no, it was when we were talking about whether it's a romance or not. And I said, it's not a romance, it's a Gothic imprisonment story. Because, I mean, this woman is basically imprisoned. She's imprisoned in a past that's not really hers. She's imprisoned in her own mind. She's imprisoned in this house. Mr. De Winter... we don't even know her name. That's another issue that's going on here because we never even get her name. Mr. De Winter is basically at best nothing. I mean, the man is psychologically abusive toward her. It's completely unclear as to what happened to his first wife precisely. And then not only is she haunted by the past wife and has this dark, brooding, disconnected, manipulative husband in a way, then you've got Mrs. Danvers, which is just a complete, just an amazing move, I think, on her part, because Mrs. Danvers becomes, in some ways, one, the most memorable character in the book, and two, she's kind of like the avatar of Rebecca. Like, you don't need a ghost, even though Mrs. Danvers keeps telling her she thinks Rebecca is a ghost, because you have Mrs. Danvers, like the weird arm from beyond the grave that's just tormenting this woman, trying to make her crazy, trying to make her leave or kill herself. So I find the Mrs. Danvers aspect of it just so interesting, because it's like this woman is trapped no matter where she turns.
No, I completely agree with what you're saying, because if Mrs. Danvers were not a part of the story at all, or if she were just kind of a stock standard, housekeeping character, it would have been a completely different novel. And I don't think it would be a memorable one at all, because in that case, we would have just dismissed it as, okay, this is a Gothic novel. This was written for women to read at the time, and it wasn't literature at all. And I think when you look at that character especially, she's the one that really stands out and shows what DuMaurier could do as a writer.
Yeah, and I think the connection between Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca is so fascinating to me because, okay, I find the Rebecca character, this aspect is so problematic to me because it's Rebecca is dead and gone, and she and Mrs. Danvers seem like the main characters to me, which is great. I mean, I know that's what's intended, but at the same time, the whole time I'm reading the book in 2017, I'm thinking, man, Mrs. Danvers' portrayal of Rebecca sounds awesome. Like, nobody can control that woman. She marries who she wants, when she wants, why she wants. She still does what she wants. She sleeps with who she wants. She's free in her sexuality. Mrs. Danvers even suggests at one point that, possibly it's not just men that she's sleeping with. It's like book just flies by really quickly. She's just such a free kind of character. And it seems like in some ways the whole thing is a punishment of her for being who she is, because in that time period, I mean, for lack of a better term, it's like they have to punish her because she's, a whore.
Yeah.
It seems like in my mind, she was making a business agreement with De Winter in a way. Like, I have to marry you to get these things, and you have to marry me to get these things. So we'll do this, and this is what I'm going to do. I mean, she tells him. And I think it's so interesting that Mrs. Danvers is supposedly evil, but she's kind of celebrating the fact that Rebecca was an individual in her own person, was this wild, kind of interesting life force. But of course, she's got to be punished. She has to be murdered. And we're supposed to be happy about that because she deserves it.
Right. Well,
even the new wife is happy about it. She's like, yeah, she deserved it. And you love me. And I'm like, man, I am so disturbed right now.
It is a weird, highlight of the cultural moment of the day, I guess, because it's almost like a magnification of the new woman, who came, 30, 40 years before, and this is like the natural extension of it. But as you said, we have to keep them in check. We have to make sure they don't go too far in this whole idea of freedom, because how dare a woman have this? And it is interesting, her relationship to the two wives and how she deals with both of them. As horrible as the husband is, you could almost write him out of the book and just have it be a book about the women, and it would still hold up pretty well.
It would, yeah, because there's all sorts of jealousy going on, between Mrs. Danvers and the new wife and Rebecca. It's almost like Mr. De Winter is just on the sidelines.
Yeah. I think that's why. I think maybe that's why this book has stood out for so long. I mean, as you mentioned, Mrs. Danvers appears as a character in Jasper Ford's Thursday Next series, which I haven't read. You said she's a clone army?
Yeah, it's been a while since I read that series. I finished the ones that were available like a year or two ago. But yeah, they make a clone army, basically, Mrs. Danvers, to fight against their enemies in the book world. And she's kind of like this, she's very efficient at cleaning up after she takes people out.
I suppose that's important when you're assassinating.
I mean, I love Jasper Ford's books, but it makes sense, I think, that Mrs. Danvers would pop up because his first book was a take on the Jane Eyre, on the Jane Eyre novel. And so I guess Rebecca has to pop in there at some point.
Well, and that soap opera, the Gothic soap opera Dark Shadows in the 1970s, ran a plot line that was eerily close to Rebecca. I don't know if they ever actually used any of the character names, but that was very close. So there was something, I think, that was kind of enduring, and people like to latch onto.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there was a Carol Burnett show spoof of Rebecca where the character was Mrs. Dampers.
Well, you had mentioned earlier, just briefly, and I can't let it pass up, seeing connections of Rebecca to The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, which that came out in 1959. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes, yeah.
So that would have been, roughly 20 years later. You want to talk about that a little bit? Because I can't let Shirley Jackson just be a mention.
Well, I mean, I don't really have any outside scholarly evidence for this other than just what I was thinking while I was reading Rebecca. But the Mrs. Danvers character, her robotic kind of way of being in the beginning and very short sentences and repeating herself over and over again and not leaving the room maybe when you think she would, and making the main character very uncomfortable, reminded me a lot of the housekeeper in The Haunting of Hill House, almost as if that housekeeper was almost a parody of Mrs. Danvers because she wasn't as important. And the other thing was the two main characters, Eleanor and Nameless Woman.
Yes.
Because one of the things I kept thinking while I was reading is the Nameless Woman in Rebecca is so quiet and shy. Basically, Rebecca and the second Mrs. De Winter are two sides of a coin, whereas Rebecca is too much of everything, too much freedom, cheating, all this stuff that she shouldn't be doing, just blowing society's codes out of the water. The new wife is the complete opposite. She's of a completely different class. She's completely inexperienced. She's young. She's fearful. I don't want to call her weak per se, because I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think she's just inexperienced. And so when even though Rebecca's dead, she's kind of tamped down by this intense personality that's shaped this house. And in The Haunting of Hill House, you have a similar character in Eleanor, who's kind of alone, has been a companion, just like the nameless Mrs. De Winter, is very quiet, shy, awkward. They both constantly fantasize and daydream rather than actually kind of doing things. They become extremely upset. They're anxious that they've done something socially improper, very worried in social situations. So there were so many similarities between them that I was just wondering. But then you can also say the same thing about the nameless governess and Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. I mean, she's a similar type. I mean, she also doesn't even have a name. Whereas Rebecca is the extreme that has to be controlled, these other characters are on the complete other side, like trying to get that, trying to rise in their class position, or trying to, in Eleanor's case, create a life for themselves. I don't know, that struck me when I was reading it.
Well, they're all very much, all three of those that you mentioned, Rebecca, The Haunting of a Hill House, The Turn of the Screw, those main characters are all very much, their stories are almost becoming stories. They're in the midst of becoming who they're supposed to be. It doesn't always turn out nice, but as you said, they're seeking something. They're seeking some sort of like new life, or trading in their old life for something better. And so they're in the midst of becoming something else. And I was also, as you were describing the character of Rebecca, I thought they don't function in the same way in the stories, but it almost kind of reminded me of the character of Theo in The Haunting of Hill House. She's kind of put there almost as a foil to Eleanor.
Yeah, that's true.
Because she comes in and she's very much comfortable with who she is, and she's comfortable in social situations, and she's got this very much larger than life personality, and her sexuality is so open and free that it's almost dangerous at points, especially to a character like Eleanor. And if you look at that with Rebecca and the nameless second wife, they are foils in that kind of way for each other, which, I don't know, that is a really interesting comparison. And now I want to kind of dig into the scholarship to see what other people have said about it.
Well, you know me, I love talking about living ghosts, and the whole time I'm thinking with the second Mrs. De Winter, it's like she's obsessed with whether Rebecca's a ghost haunting the place. She's actually the ghost haunting the place, because she has no place. Everything is monogrammed with Rebecca's name. Everything is Rebecca's and can't be touched. Like she can't just say, I want to go in this room and hang out, because there's not a fire there, because Rebecca never had one. And it's like Rebecca is still running the house through Mrs. Danvers, creating all these shrines to her. That the new wife in some ways is, what social connections does she have? She has no family. She burned her bridge with her employer. She's just got her husband, who is going through his own problems because he's scared that Rebecca's body is going to be found, isn't really paying attention to her. And Mrs. Danvers even says to her when she's trying to get her to jump out the window, you have nothing. You have nowhere to go. Your marriage is a sham. You know what you got to do. And Rebecca is supposed to be the ghost in the story, and she has used this powerful personality from beyond the grave, but she in some ways is like covering up and dampening and ghosting the second wife, who, let's just say, Manderley is a tomb for the second wife. Like, she goes in there and disappears from everything that had come before. And I don't really know that there's any place for her to go. At the end of the book, they're wandering around with gossip behind them and no home to go back to. In some ways, I think De Winter kind of, he doesn't physically kill his second wife, but he definitely socially kills her, and he kind of kills her personality. Even though she thinks she gets one, she's just waiting on him hand and foot, doing whatever he wants, and making herself subservient to the stories that he needs to tell to get out of his murder charge. So, I mean, I feel like the second wife is even more ghostly than the ghost that she's afraid of and thinks she's fighting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me when you were talking about Manderley as being her tomb, because I think you're absolutely right. And it's a shrine to Rebecca. And this is where DuMaurier, I think, is really masterful, is how frightening Manderley is presented and how well she builds that tension. Because when you see the new wife coming and she's kind of walking through the house, and as you said, there are rooms you can't go in and things you can't touch, and it's terrifying when you're reading it. Kind of in the same way that Hill House is under Shirley Jackson's hands, even though she does things differently. But the house, even though it's been lived in and it's being lived in, has a abandoned feel to it. And maybe that's because it has become a shrine to a dead woman. I don't know, but it, almost shades of that myth Bluebeard. I don't know if I have anything super smart to say about that other than her descriptions of walking through the house are a study in tension building, I think. Oh, yeah, especially that creepy West Wing where Mrs. Danvers, has the literal Rebecca shrine set up. Yeah. That was just, I think that is one of the most terrifying moments in the book. Yeah. Well, because it's the forbidden, right? It's the place she's not allowed to go. It's the place she's not supposed to go. Because it's the place that literally has another woman's, name all over. It doesn't belong to her. And so she's an outsider there. And that can be scary in any situation. But when you put Mrs. Danvers there, it becomes especially terrifying. Well, and it's also like, it's a literal representation of the secret past that she's been trying to figure out. Even Mrs. Danvers is like, oh, you're just as excited by all this as I am, aren't you? You want to touch the clothes. And I'm like, whoa, this is creepy, This woman is supposed to be her house, and yet there's an entire wing of the house that's devoted to the previous person. It totally screws up public and private. Basically, second Mrs. De Winter is exactly like the village people who pay their $5 on Tuesday or Wednesday or whatever to come through for a tour. There's parts of the house that she can't go in because they're too private. They're a dead woman's private things. Yeah. And yet she's the person who's supposed to be running the house. I mean, the uncanny inversion that DuMaurier does with that, the idea of the secret, almost private tomb-like aspect of it is so creepy. And it works so well, Yeah, this is what kills me because, I know that like Gothic and romance will often kind of be smushed together, even though that makes me bristle. And, even just recently with a movie that came out a few years ago, Crimson Peak, which Del Toro was adamant about calling a Gothic romance. He's like, this isn't a horror movie; it's a Gothic romance, and I saw it, and it was, and it dealt with a lot of these same Gothic tropes. But you want to talk about creepy? You don't look to a Gothic romance. You open up Rebecca and try not to tell me that it's not at least a dark thriller, if not a horror tale. Okay, speaking of creepy, Lisa, when you got to the part in the book where we find out that the whole time Mr. De Winter has been a murderer, because he murdered Rebecca, shot her, and then made it look like it was an accident in her boat, were you creeped out at all? Number one, by the fact that it turns out the guy has been the villain the whole time, not Mrs. Danvers. And two, the fact that brings them closer together. I was kind of like, why is this not making you run away as fast as possible? Well, I mean, no, I guess it didn't surprise me because he was such a foreboding type of character. Even though he wasn't as important to the plot, I don't think, as say, Mrs. Danvers or even Rebecca. he was still this character that cast a dark shadow over the entire thing. And, he made you worry about the second wife very early on because, I don't know, at least for me, he was the character that made me feel sympathy for her very early on because you start to worry, as you called her, inexperienced. What did this inexperienced girl get herself into? So, it really didn't surprise me. Of course, in my mind, he is always Laurence Olivier. I guess because, the Alfred Hitchcock adaptation, which, by the way, was only produced 2 years after the book was published. The book was published in 1938, and then the adaptation came out in 1940, which I found kind of interesting.
Yeah, Laurence Olivier just didn't seem like dark and brooding and moody enough for me.
No, but it is an interesting choice to have the second wife, rather than run away when she discovers her husband is a murderer, kind of align herself with him. And to tell you the truth, that's one of those questions that I'm not sure I know what to do with, because part of me is screaming Stockholm Syndrome. And
yes.
But then part of me is thinking, well, this is her natural. If this is a book about her becoming something, this is it. She's gone through some experiences. We can no longer call her that, kind of shy, inexperienced, doesn't know about the world. She knows about the world and she's ready to fully embrace it, which kind of connects her to Eleanor in that way. Because Eleanor certainly in The Haunting of Hill House kind of attaches herself to something.
Yeah, she tries different things. And
it doesn't, maybe work out well for her. And I don't know if we can have hope that it works out well for the second Mrs. De Winter, but it's an interesting choice to make. I don't know, you kind of mentioned the casting of Laurence Olivier, and I don't know, do you feel like in that adaptation that they maybe played down his character at all?
I think so. I hadn't really thought about it in connection with the casting, but now I'm starting to think that, because I don't know. I mean, Laurence Olivier didn't a couple times in the book she describes him as almost like this Byronic hero in an Italian painting, with the dark cloak and the really dark hair, the kind of bushy eyebrows. Like, I had a completely different picture in my mind. And then when I rewatched the movie with Laurence Olivier, I was like, what? That's not Maxim de Winter. No way, and he didn't even really strike the mood either, because when she goes over the rocks in the book to chase the dog and finds the cabin, which was the murder scene, though she doesn't know it. She thinks it's another shrine. He runs back to the house super fast. She's running out of breath. She's hurting the dog trying to pull it. He refuses to talk to her. He's just yelling at her. I was actually scared for her at that point in the book. It was kind of terrifying. In the movie, there's happy music playing while it's happening. And he stops and he's like, oh, I'm such a horrible person. I'm sorry you have to put up with my moods. And I'm like, there was barely any mood. The transition was so quick. If I hadn't read the book and known that they were trying to be so close to the book, I wouldn't have even really noticed. And I wasn't quite sure about those choices, other than just maybe trying to make the husband be a hero, as hard as that is. Because one of the things I did notice in the movie is that in the movie, because of the film codes of the time, he doesn't shoot Rebecca. Rebecca's horrible and everything. And he says over and over again she needs to be punished, and he wanted to kill her. But he actually didn't. When she was taunting him with the illegitimate child idea that's not true, as she does in the book, trying to get him to kill her, she falls past him and hits her head and dies. And he covered it up because he freaked out. And I guess that's a way of saying it's okay. He's not a murderer. It's okay that she loves him. Now that horrible Rebecca is out of the way, hopefully they'll be happy together. And it kind of disturbed me a little bit, having just read the book and rewatching the movie, because I'm like, no, even though Mrs. Danvers, won, made it on the Guardian's list of the best baddies, Maxim is not a goodie, in my opinion. And I felt like the movie very much tried to sugarcoat him so they could have a hero and a heroine at the end, happy and going off in the world while bad Mrs. Danvers burns herself up in the house,
Yeah, I completely agree. And I had never connected. I always just thought it was a bizarre choice to make in the end, but I had never connected it to the film codes, which makes a lot of sense now that you said it. But yeah, it even changes the second wife and who she becomes, because in the book, by aligning herself with her husband once she knows the truth, she almost becomes complicit in Rebecca's death. And so she is, as you said, she may not be as bad as Mrs. Danvers, but she's firmly on their side. And in the movie adaptation, she's still allowed to kind of be the innocent heroine. And she can still love this man because, he didn't mean it, which is disturbing on several levels. But I don't know. I kind of like the idea of taking this innocent and watching her become evil almost by the end. It was kind of a fun transformation.
It is interesting. I mean, she is the heroine and she becomes complicit and she welcomes the complicity.
Yeah.
In fact, I mean, Mr. DeWinter even says at one point, like, I've ruined you. And he means she's not naive and innocent, which I think that whatever, like, she does need to face the real world. He can't. It's like Rebecca had too much freedom, so he wants to stunt the other woman. But at the same time, DuMaurier kind of shows how all this like psychological manipulation this woman has gone through, it is kind of like Stockholm syndrome. It's like she spent the whole time just trying to make Mr. DeWinter happy and thinking Mr. DeWinter didn't love her. He actually loved Rebecca. And in the end, it's like, he may be a murderer, but at least I know he loves me. And it kind of reminds me of Eleanor's idea of like buying into this like romance will fix everything. It may not be perfect, but at least I'm doing what I think I should do. I thought it was an interesting way to end it. And it also pokes holes in the whole, like, this is a great romance novel too, I think.
Absolutely.
There's a darkness there. Unless you're going back to like Hawthorne type romance. And then I guess if you're thinking like romance like we think of nowadays, that kind of blows that out of the water because it's just such a dark place it ends up in.
Yeah. Yeah, it absolutely does. And it scrubs away any morality tale that may have existed in the plot, which I think the Hitchcock version kind of plays that up a little bit because you have the evil first wife who had to be done away with, and then you have the innocent who can still come through with her naivete somewhat intact, and she's in love and everything's okay. And DuMaurier, explodes that by the end. That idea of there's one good one and one bad one, which I kind of like. I like a story that doesn't have a clear morality. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because it kind of shows women's position in society. Like they're obviously Rebecca and the narrator are extremes. And there's a whole world in between them that, happens in reality. But there is an interesting kind of tension for DuMaurier to do like the bad twin, evil twin, foil splitting persona, and I think in some ways I feel bad for Mrs. Danvers.
No, you don't.
And I think we see how superficial and kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like stuck in the way he thinks he should be that Maxim de Winter is, because he never makes any real relationships in the whole book. It's always what it can get him.
Right, which is an interesting look at masculinity versus femininity. Right, he's essentially doing what Rebecca did. He lives his life based on where can this get me? What can this get me? He's as much a manipulator as she was. And that way maybe they were a perfect match, which was why they couldn't exist together in the same home. So he finds a wife that will do what he wants, which he certainly gets by the end.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like he wants to control and infantilize, and Rebecca didn't work, and so he's got to find somebody else, and unfortunately, it's our narrator.
And I love that we never get her name, because it doesn't matter.
Right, yeah. All right. I know this was going to be a Rebecca-centric episode, and it certainly has been, but I also wanted to throw out there, I hope in the future we can talk about DuMaurier's short stories, because I really enjoyed Rebecca so much that I actually started reading her short stories. I've gotten through Don't Look Now, which was published in 1971 and became a movie in 1973 with Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland. It's fantastic. It's a story about clairvoyance. It is so creepy and scary. And it really has nothing to do with romance. So if you agree with us that DuMaurier is all about the horror and the gothicism, then check that out. And then I read The Birds, which I have to say, I love Hitchcock's adaptation, but the story is so much better. And she builds the suspense so well. And she kind of deals with the apocalyptic nature of it so well. I kind of wish that I had read it earlier so I could have thrown it into the apocalypse episode. So I think next I'm going to read The Blue Lenses, which I've heard is like her other really awesome short story. So again, thank you, listeners, for starting me on this DuMaurier kick, which will probably last me for a while. And please, if you haven't read anything other than Rebecca, join us and go find her other stuff, because she is a real gem, I think.
Yeah, I'm with you. I want to read some of her short stories. And this is why we put her up as a potential master of horror. And I think why, Mel, you and I are both very excited that she was chosen as the master of horror, because she did suspense so well. And she can send a chill down your spine very easily, it seems. I'm also looking forward to reading My Cousin Rachel, which came out in 1951 and was just made into actually a second movie. The first movie was with Richard Burton. And this one is with Rachel Weisz, the 2017 one. But apparently that one deals with a heroine who kind of exists between the good and the bad. Kind of in the way I think Rebecca, we could describe her that way. So anyway, I'm excited to read that. But it's funny that you said Don't Look Now, because that was the first one I wrote down that I want to read next. So yeah.
Oh, it's awesome.
Well, I really can't wait. But yeah, Mel, as you said, I hope listeners join us. And if you read some of this stuff, tell us what you think. Send us an email or find us on social media, because we'd love to hear what you think.
This is the No Fear Podcast. You can find us online at Twitter and Instagram at No Fear Cast. That's KNOW Fearcast. Or our website, nofearcast.com. If you want to contact us, send us an email to nofearcast@gmail.com. Download us through iTunes, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found. If you like what you hear, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, or you can support us on Patreon. Supporters get special perks such as early access to our main episodes and exclusive mini-episodes released on the weeks in between our normal schedule, depending on the tier you choose. Even a little bit makes a big difference. The No Fear Cast. We know what scares you. This is a personal project and not related to any academic institution.